Thank you. Just checking. So welcome to January 14th Special Committee of the Whole. I'd like to start by acknowledging we're holding this meeting on the traditional lands of the Ka'aman Nation, who are a treaty nation and privileged to be here. We would start with adoption of the agenda, and I've had one proposed addition to the agenda for the committee's consideration, and that is 8.1, Minister Invitation to Housing Special Network Event, added by Councillor Elliott. Sorry, Councillor Isaacson. It wasn't me, I didn't do it. So if we're in favor of that addition to the agenda, I'd entertain a motion to adopt the agenda. Councillor Isaacson.
I'll move adoption with the addition of 8.1, Minister Invitation to Housing Speed Networking Event.
Seconded by Councillor Southcott. Any comments? All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, that's unanimous. We do have an agenda. And the first thing on our agenda is the adoption of minutes. Do I see anyone trying to make any motions? Councillor Isaacson, seconded by Councillor Doubt. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, unanimous. The adoption of the minutes has happened. That brings us to reports for decision, and I would turn the floor over to our CFO, Deniston.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I am presenting the 2025 completed property assessment roll, and I have two BC assessment staff online with us. Mr. Manger is the manager of specialized costs, and Mr. Primo is a deputy assessor. They will be available after the presentation to answer any questions relating to processes around potential changes in a major industry class. They by no means have a crystal ball as to what future assessments may hold, but they do have collectively a lot of experience in and around processes for major industry assessments and changes to those. Before we dive into this report, I'll review where we are in the financial planning process. The budget schedule found on page 13 of the report shows that the budget process started in May when the schedule was approved. After this, Draft 1 was delivered in early December with direction for changes to Draft 2. A property tax rate report was also delivered in early December, and staff were provided with property tax rate setting direction, which will commence in March. Concurrently, an online and paper budget feedback survey launched in December and will close on January 19th. As well, Council is hosting a budget public open house this Thursday, January 16th, in Council chambers between 4 and 7. So that is my shameless plug for that event. I look forward to having these chambers full. The next step in the process is to analyze the property assessments, which is called the completed roll. This roll is a summary of the property assessments for the City of Powell River by property class, and it is produced by BC Assessment in early January each year. For most communities, the completed roll doesn't change significantly from year to year. However, for the City of Powell River, the assessment roll has had a risk of significant change to the major industry class since the closure of the Tisquat Mill in December 2021. As a result, the completed roll is a big piece of the financial planning puzzle, since changes to the major industry class could result in a large and sudden increase in property taxes to the other property classes. So what does the 2025 roll showed? It showed a nominal change over 2024. For both 2024 and 2025, the assessment value is 91% residential, 6% business class, 2% major industry, and the final 1% making up the remaining 6 property classes. The assessment roll did increase by $86 million, which is a 2.3% increase. This change is made up of both a market change and a non-market change. For background, market changes refer to fluctuations in property values driven by changes to supply and demand in the market. Market increases only change how property taxes are allocated across the classes. For example, say the average market increase was 1.4% and your property had a market increase of 5%, you would pay a slightly higher increase in taxes than, say, your friend who had a market decrease of 3%. In this scenario, there is no addition to the assessment base through new development. It's just a reallocation of the current assessment class. So those are market changes. And they shift the tax burden around. The non-market changes are due to all other types of changes in the assessment base, including new construction, property class changes, exemption changes, new development, subdivisions, and zoning changes. Non-market changes generally expand the tax base, resulting in lower taxes for the rest of the taxpayers in the short term. I reference the short term because new development doesn't often pay for itself in the longer term. For example, the city infrastructure to service those new properties will need to be replaced in the future. So it does increase costs in the future, but in the short term, it feels like a little bit of a reprieve to the rest of the class because there's more properties to spread out the tax burden across. So that's the difference between market and non-market change. For the city, I mentioned we had an $86 million increase for 2.3%. 1.4% of this increase related to market changes, 0.9% related to non-market changes. The market changes were mainly driven by residential class for $33 million, followed by the business class at $13 million, and then the major industry class for $7 million. So overall, I would say the market changes had a nominal shift in the tax burden across the property tax classes. Now, the non-market change is comprised of a $41 million increase, offset by an $8 million decrease. The increase was driven by $38 million in the residential class, mainly from development in the single-family and multifamily dwellings. The $8 million non-market decline was in the major industry class due to changes in inventory identified through BC Assessment's inspection process. It is very positive news to see new development in the residential class, but this increase does not fully offset the non-market decline in major industry, since the major industry tax rate is higher than the residential rate. However, it is a much, much smaller than anticipated decline, so overall, this is very positive news for 2025. But even given this positive news, there is still much uncertainty around the future value and class of the Tisquat mill site. The site could be removed from major industry class, pending future dismantling efforts and subsequent inspections. The type of operation at the site could be changed and no longer qualify as one of the 17 approved major industry operations. Additionally, the mill assessment could be appealed, which could result in a lower valuation and/or class in 2025. So given the minimal change to the major industry property class in 2025 and the risk to its valuation in the future, a transfer to the Property Tax Stabilization Reserve Fund could be considered in 2025. This fund, established in 2024, aims to smooth out abnormal increases or decreases to the property taxpayers resulting from changes in the major industry class assessment. The current fund balance is $1.6 million plus interest, which will be finalized later in the year-end process. 3 options for a 2025 stabilization reserve contribution of $600,000, $300,000, or $0 are presented for consideration. Note that the total property tax collected over the 5-year period is the same in all options. The difference is the timing of the property tax collection, not the total amount that would be collected. The more money saved up front results in smoother future increases, whereas less money saved up front could result in a large one-time increase in the year that a mill assessment would change. Three options include forecasts based on best possible data assumptions. The first assumption is that the major industry class is revalued to be partially business and partially utilities in 2026. It is not possible to predict the future, but based on the efforts to dismantle this site since the mill's closure, this is the best 2026 estimate available at this time. Given that this assessment assumes that the mill would be closed in 2026 and revalued, it would also assume that in 2026 would be the year the full stabilization reserve would be utilized. As mentioned, the only difference amongst these three scenarios is the contribution to the property tax stabilization reserve. Option 1 of $600,000 is the highest amount before your 2025 increase for an average single family dwelling might be higher than next year. So that's why that one was selected as your ceiling. 300,000 was picked as middle ground and also 0. The other assumption built into these forecasts, because we do need to create forecasts in order to make these big decisions currently, is the property tax levy in draft 1 has been used for the basis of the property tax in all three scenarios. Finally, the completed assessment roll was used as a basis for the assessment in 2025 and then adjusted in 2026 to 2029 based on the best estimate of where the mill site could go. So those are the estimates in this forecast, and it allows us to paint a picture of what might happen in likely scenarios, but by no means, again, is it a crystal ball. We can dig into each option. Option 1 is, again, the $600,000 increase in property taxes, and then that would be transferred into the stabilization reserve. The advantage of this option is that it is the most smooth increase in property taxes for an average single family dwelling. So the increase in 2025 would be about $400 or 13.9%. And then the following year, it would be $427 or 14.3%. You can see on the graph, the smooth line would represent, even distribution of increases across the years. The disadvantage of option 1, of course, is that the property taxes would need to increase further in 2025. Option 2 is middle ground. It is a transfer of $300,000. This, as you can see with the graph, is not as smooth of a transition between 2024 and 2025, and then 2025 and 2026. It's a $368 increase this year, or 14.3%, and then a $497 increase, or 16.9% in the next year. Finally, the option of no savings in 2025. The benefit of this option is that it's the lowest property tax option for 2025 at about $336 for an average single family dwelling, or 13%. Then in 2025, it would be a steeper line there, a steeper increase of $567 or 19.5%. So this option is advantageous because it is the lowest amount in 2025. But of course, should these assumptions prove to be accurate or within a reasonable accuracy, next year, average single family dwelling could be seeing a 19.5% increase. So to summarize this report, wrap it all up, there was a 2.3% increase in the assessment roll, and 0.9% was due to non-market change. Residential mainly drove the non-market increase, which was slightly offset by the non-market decrease to major industry. While this is a much smaller than anticipated non-market change to the mill site, there is, of course, the looming risk of the mill being removed from major industry class in 2026, which would result in an estimated 19.5% increase for an average single family dwelling if there were no more future savings to the stabilization reserve. As a result of this risk, Council may direct an increase to the 2025 property tax levy to set aside savings in the stabilization reserve fund to offset potential significant changes in the mill's assessed value. So staff are therefore seeking direction from the committee on whether to increase the property tax levy in draft 2 to propose savings to the property tax stabilization reserve, or to not include additional savings in 2025. To conclude, I will outline the next steps of the budget process. Residents are encouraged to fill out the budget survey online. The link is provided on the city's website, or by paper copies, which can be picked up at the rec center, City Hall, and the library. We ran out of paper copies at City Hall for the first time and printed some more on the spot, but that's a good indication that we might get some good feedback this year. That was the first time we've run out of paper copies, so that's good news. Residents are also again encouraged to attend the open house this Thursday from 4 to 7 in council chambers. The next budget report is scheduled for February 4th, and so this will be the results of the engagement. And this is another opportunity for the committee to provide direction for changes to draft 2, which will then be presented on February 27th. Again, property tax rates will be discussed in March when more firm direction for the tax levy is established. This concludes the presentation, and thank you for your time. As a reminder, Mr. Primo, Mr. Manger, and I are available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just before I go to getting questions asked, I wanted to correct an oversight at the beginning of the meeting. I ought to have let folks know that our mayor, your worship, Woznow and Councillor Almeida are absent with leave. And so I just wanted to correct that or make sure that I had that. Then I would open the floor for questions. I have Councillor Isaacson, Councillor Doubt, Councillor Silas-Scott.
Sure, we'll all have questions. One is actually perhaps a minor correction through the chair to staff. On the calendar of what has happened so far, on December 17th, we weren't continuing the rate discussion, we were continuing the draft 1 discussion.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. Did I have that wrong on the screen?
Yeah,
I apologize.
It was right. Anyways.
Yes, thank you.
Minor detail, but just I was like, I think we only discussed that one once.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just ask my first question. So last year we were able to put in about 1.6 million into the stabilization fund because the bylaw, the revitalization bylaw ran out. And so we kind of got like bonus tax revenue that we weren't usually used to getting. I'm wondering why this year, you explained briefly why you recommended $600,000. Why is that different than the 1.6 million before, and why is it why is any contribution to the stabilization fund resulting in a further increase above and beyond what we had seen in draft 1 of the budget?
Through the chair, if I understand it correctly, this year we're looking at the analysis with 1.6 million plus some interest to apply to the potential change in assessment, whereas last year we only had $0. So I think the evaluation this year is a little bit different because of that. So does that answer the question? I feel like that I might have missed what you're getting at there.
Confused. So given that the assessment for the mill site is similar to last year, and the rate, without any further instruction would remain the same, would we not be getting that 5 point whatever million that we got last year, which is about 1.6 above and beyond what we had been receiving in years previous? And so I'm wondering why there isn't that 1.6 million again.
Through the chair, last year's property tax increases were about, I think, 13 or 14%, so they were still quite significant. Half of that was that 1.6. That additional revenue technically still exists. They would, if the rate stayed about the same, you would be seeing close to what they gave last year. Because of the non-market decrease, there is about, I don't want to give numbers because tax rates aren't set, so they're just estimates that I've used, but there is a decrease in their contribution. But that increase still exists. I think we're faced with larger increases to the tax levy than last year due to capital requirements. And so that is also a factor that the increase we're going in with is higher than last year. Last year we were going in with a starting point of 9%, and this year it's 11.4.
So then 600,000 could go to the stabilization fund, and it's approximate, it's not exact, but like let's say the other million of quote unquote more of what we're used to getting is going to capital improvements to try to reduce the burden on taxpayers this year. Is that correct?
Yes, through the chair. I think that if I understand that, that's correct.
I have another question, but I'll wait till the first round's done.
Also, Doubt?
Yeah, so this might be a bit of a long-winded set sort of questions. So Councillor Isaacson's kind of touched on what was confusing me the first time I briefly read this report. And that is that this report isn't suggesting that we do the same thing we did last year. And what happened last year is we set a taxation rate for everybody. All the properties that were assessed paid that taxation rate, and the mill paid 1.6 million more than they had the year before. So what council decided to do is take that 1.6 million and put it into a reserve, a future taxation mitigation reserve. We didn't increase taxes by 1.6 million. We left taxes as they were, collected the money, and put 1.6 million into a reserve. The recommendation we have in front of us today is completely different, okay? It is to take all of the discussions we had about costs and about services back on December 17th, look at that as the cost side of our balance sheet, and over on the revenue side, add another $600,000 to taxation. According to my math, what we did last in December was we looked at the 14.4% tax increase and made some recommendations. We asked staff to come back with options about how to change that. 3 options, going down to a tax increase of 5%. And I think from reading this report, if we take all of those things, we actually do reduce the expenditures so that taxes would be 5%. And we're still looking at another 2.5% on top of that to cover this recommendation that we increase taxation by $600,000. And so that's the first question. Am I right about that?
Through the chair, if I understand that correctly, yes, that is correct. We did increase property taxes by an additional 1.6, but people didn't feel it because last year was the first and only year that shift in the assessment would happen. This year, the shift hasn't happened, so we won't get that discrepancy between the increase in the levy and how the increase in an average single family dwelling. So I think that's the disconnect there. We're always focusing on property tax increases, and when you do that and you're looking at year over year changes, instead of absolute dollar changes, what we'll find is last year was the only year we would have got to feel those tailwinds where we could increase property tax levy and people weren't going to feel it. This year, because the assessment has barely changed, as from a change perspective, there's no protection for the average single family dwelling. There's no tailwind. That's just a one-time thing. Unless it went from 82 million to 110, then we could capture some tailwinds there and scoot it into a reserve. But that was just that one time. As from a change perspective, you'll see that only in that first year. So it does get to Councillor Dowd's comments, it does get more difficult in the years where you don't have that tailwind. That increase for the stabilization reserve will be felt by the average single family dwelling as it hits the property tax levy. So it is a harder year to make that decision. And but I do think council was very prudent last year to make that decision and get the reserve established, put 1.6 million in there. It is earning interest and it has added a lot of protection as it is already. So those are, I can understand the question a little bit more, and thank you for your comments. That is, as I understand it, correct.
That's what I was trying to get at. this motion here, the recommendation here, would increase taxation by $600,000 or approximately, according to my math, and I don't like to do percentage comparisons like that, but it would increase taxation by about 2.5%. That's what I wanted to talk about. So my difficulty is that we have asked for options about the expense side, and we don't know what that outcome is going to be. Makes it really difficult for me to make a decision today when I know that when we come back, when staff comes back with it, I don't know exactly when you're going to come back with the options on the expenditures. We will either have to do something that fits with this recommendation or reconsider this recommendation somehow. So I think we're kind of getting mixed up about what we're trying to do. We're having meetings about one side of the balance sheet separate without considering the other side. We're talking about expenses without talking about the revenue, or we're talking about revenue without talking about the expenses. And I'd really like to be talking about both things at the same time. Because frankly, these numbers that go anywhere from 11.4 to a 19.5% tax increase are going to be scary for people without having a nice long explanation. I read every word in your report here on this a couple of times, and I think I understand it, but I think we're doing something different than we did before. What we're really doing, if I understand it correctly, is increasing taxes this year so that we can, next year, we can use the taxation stabilization fund to reduce the increase in taxes to a similar rate in 2026 as it would be in 2025. So the whole thing is about smoothing the tax increase rate. And it's not going to lead to tax reductions or a lower rate of increase over the long term. It's just going to smooth it out so we don't all get it hitting us in 2026 after perhaps saving ourselves the embarrassment of having it happen in 2025. That's my understanding. If I'm wrong, maybe you could fill me in. But I think it's important that we understand exactly where we are in the decisions. And frankly, I would rather make the decisions about revenue and expenses at the same time rather than make them at separate meetings.
I got Councillor Southcott, followed by Councillor Paul.
I found myself trying to explain some of this stuff at a meeting last night. And I always try to boil things down because even though I've been familiar with numbers for a long time, it's still challenging. And the challenge here, referring to the last two questions, are comparisons between a context that relates to a year ago and 2 years ago. Really, these are two different. We're comparing to, although we haven't really stated it that way, we're comparing two different contexts. This is how I'm seeing it, and I'm going to ask the same question as Councillor Dowd. Please tell me if I'm wrong on this. I'm just trying to find ways to understand it myself. The relevance to me is that I'm really concerned about the contexts coming. So next year and the year after. And we talked about reserve funds for years as a solution to what we knew was coming, and that was the closure of the mill around this table. So now we've finally done it, and that felt extremely good last year because it's like, okay, we're giving ourselves some safety, something to buffer our poor community faced with the rapidly increasing costs and not as rapidly increasing revenues for any of us. So the question in my mind is, about the assumption of this report, and that is it, I understand this report to be based on the assumption of no change to the tax class. Like, we understand there's a change to the assessment value of the mill, but it wasn't as big as what was anticipated, and that is like, thank you. You guys on the right. Anyway, but that assumption could change. We can't change it now because it hasn't happened, and we can't really legitimately predict the future. But this could happen, could it not? And if the reason why I'm thinking this is because if or when it happens, that will be a big change that is not baked into these figures now, or our anticipation. So it's not the assumption. Is that correct? We haven't got those figures for the next couple of years, although.
Through the chair, so to address the first question of, is it correct that we're doing something different than last year? It's the same approach as last year. Increase property taxes, put that increase in a reserve, apply it against property taxes in the next year to bring the property taxes down. So it's just saving some this year. Last year, it was the exact same process. We increased property taxes. And the reason last year was a bit of an easier year to do it was the first year the exemption was done. And so from an increase perspective, that was the first and only year we would have felt this difference between an increase in the levy and how it affected the average single family dwelling. And now that the assessment is now at 82, it would have to go up for us to feel any change. So it's the same process as last year. It feels different because it's a harder decision. There's no tailwind to capture, but it is the same process there. And your second question about the future. So the assumptions built in with these three options does assume that the mill site in 2026 is reassessed as business and utilities. So our best guess being, hey, at this rate, and since it's closed since 2021, and when we look at all the other mills around and see the inevitable future there, our best guess is, there would be a change in 2026. And so these scenarios are modeling a reality where that change happens in 2026, and we apply all of our savings. We use it next year because that's the year that big change happens, and so that's the assumptions built in. Again, it's a best estimate, but option one shows a smoother increase because there's more savings in 2025, whereas when we compare this to option 3, 2025 is a lower cost for average single family dwelling, which is great for 2025, but that's a steeper line to get to 3,482 in the next year, should that be the year the assessment change happens. And of course, there's estimates in that. We're estimating values of what that would look like and when it would happen. And so this is an exercise of weighing risk. And so there's no right or wrong. It was difficult to even make a recommendation. The recommendation is just such that it's the most conservative option. Other than that, this is a very difficult decision because it's not black and white, and it's weighing risk, and there's no crystal ball. So, yeah.
Councillor Palm.
Yeah, thank you through the chair. This is as Councillor Doubt and Councillor Southcott has pointed out, very confusing. I've never had a presentation with this much statistics and asked to decipher so many graphs and whatnot in my time here. So I think, as Councillor Doubt has pointed out, this is your ask today is putting the cart before the horse. Until we take a look at the expenditure side, the savings side, we really don't have any idea where we're at today until we have a very healthy discussion on Thursday and get more facts. Because right now, myself, I can see the nice graphs that are presented, the increase in property taxes, the additional 600 has to come from somewhere. It's very confusing as to how much that is going to cost the taxpayers of this community, for me. I'm only speaking for myself. Maybe these guys have already figured it out, but I certainly haven't. And I think instead of voting on the resolution before us on the agenda today, we should hold off and have that healthy discussion on Thursday, get more facts, and obviously hear from the expert on the screen in terms of assessment of our mill site and how that is going to work out down the road. I'd really like to hear from that. So that's kind of where I'm at, and I hope we delay making any decision on this front today. Thanks.
So I'm going to do a second round of questions because we have some folks interested. I just had some questions of my own. The process is not necessarily different. It was just presented a bit differently last year. So the process has always been, we have a total tax levy, and last year we increased that tax levy by 1.6 million in order to include a transfer into a reserve. The proposed options here have us doing that for 600, 300, or 0. The main difference as I see it is taxation increases, which are mainly driven, if I understand it correctly, by increased need to put into capital reserves to maintain our flagging capital. So the big driver between all of the increases on the entire chart that keep going up is what we need to do in order to meet our obligations for maintaining our capital assets. And maybe a graph that actually showed how much of that increase each time is being redirected over to capital would be really helpful for everybody in understanding what's driving that. But that's my question. Is that correct?
Through the chair, one of the main drivers for property tax levy increase, just the increased cost to the city, is the increased need for capital savings. And in draft 1, this is capital savings versus spending. So you can kind of start seeing, how much we're saving each year. And the reason it's not presented differently than last year. Last year, we went from 3.2 million to say 5.2 million from the mill. Great. We took that and we saved it. Instead of letting an average single family dwelling have a decrease in a year where we actually increased taxes, because if we did that this year, 11.4 would feel like 20. So that was easy last year because it was that first and only year where there was what we'll call a non-market change. Non-market change is changes in exemptions. The revitalization bylaw exemption expired last year. It was a massive non-market increase for the city, one-time increase in revenue. We don't get that again this year because we're just talking about changes. So that's why it's different than last year. It is presented the same. It's just you don't have that gap between what we will increase taxes by and how it will feel for the average single family dwelling. That only occurred last year. So this year it's a more difficult decision that way.
So then I'll follow that up with my question regarding the existing reserve. Is that for 1.6? Is that spent in the draft 1 budget?
Through the chair, that is not spent in the draft 1 because when we did draft 1 in December, we weren't sure what we would see for the property assessments, which is partly why we did a little bit of a later budget, because we didn't know if we'd be using the stabilization reserve, adding to it, or doing nothing until this report came out. And so now that we see that, this is an opportunity for council to say, hey, let's increase our taxes a bit. Let's save that. Please bring that back in draft 2 on February 27th as an option. And we can look at all of these changes together because as we progress through the budget, when we spoke on December 17, we received some direction and staff are working on compiling those savings to present as part of draft 2. Today's an opportunity to give input for draft 2. The recommendation could be worded to be more that it's presented as an option. And on February, did I say 4th, we'll do an engagement results. And again, another option to give feedback for draft 2. When we come back in February, we say, here's our starting point draft 1. Here's everything we've talked about and where it would bring us. And then council would give direction for the subsequent draft at that point. So that's kind of a process review and just kind of another explanation of why it feels different than last year. And I completely understand that. And to be honest, hadn't thought of it until the question was asked. But of course, last year would have been a much easier year for this decision. So, I don't take that lightly. Certainly a bigger decision this year, more difficult decision to weigh.
So for clarity, the option for doing no increases to that reserve fund would still leave that reserve fund at the 1.6 that we did last year.
Through the chair, yes.
Okay. I'm going to save my next question for later. We're going to go back to Councillor Isaacson for round 2.
Thank you, Chair. A couple just questions for clarification on the schedule. Councillor Palm was referencing a discussion on Thursday. We don't have a meeting on Thursday unless we have the open house. We don't have a budget discussion. We have an open house. There's no
open house budget discussion.
So I'm just going to intervene. So what Councillor Isaacson is trying to say is it is not a discussion of council or committee of the whole. It is a discussion with staff and the public for open house. So it isn't an opportunity for us to debate or discuss the budget as a council or a committee of the whole. This is what she was meaning. Yeah. It's an open house on draft 1 of the budget. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. And questions on timing again. On this schedule, you mentioned February 4th for public engagement results and February 27th for draft 2. Is February 27th when the options to align with that 5% increase would come to us?
Through the chair, that is correct. Okay. So if direction was given to add this, what you would see is, and it's debatable, but I would assume you would get down to that 5%. So I'd take draft 1. We add the increase in contribution to the community forest, which was direction. We would add increase for stabilization reserve, and then we'd go down to the 5%. And each of those items would be essentially options. That is how I would assume the direction to be, and then discussion could pursue from that point.
And so then there's a little bit of hesitation I've heard from a couple council members about making decisions on this, given that we haven't seen the options. And so I'm wondering the most helpful direction for you might be to make a recommendation, knowing that when we have the picture on the 27th, we may decide to make some changes to any of those items, expenses, but also to the recommendation that we've given you today, rather than making no recommendation.
Through the chair, I think that from what I'm hearing, that might be good direction. If council's curious as to what this looks like, mixed in with the other direction for draft 2, the recommendation could be altered to include this as an option in draft 2, so that we're not coming to draft 2 with an increased tax levy and you need to make a decision to reverse it out. We're coming to draft 2 with draft 1 still as the base tax levy, and we're only changing that levy if council votes any of those options presented to be included. So, and maybe Ms. Lafort could help with wording, but we could make that clear in the recommendation so that this is just simply presented as another option similar to the decreasing to 5%.
Thank you. So my substantial question is related to the use, to the part of the recommendation that relates to 2026 and using the fund. And this might relate back to your reference to we're looking at changes, not exact amounts. But given that we don't know for sure next year's assessment, I'm wondering why we would make this a recommendation now versus waiting to see till next year, or using that money over more than 1 year, and whether that would make the changes more smoothly. If you could just speak to the rationale of talking about 2026 and using that stabilization fund, having that discussion this year.
Yes, through the chair. I did some analysis over 2 years. I actually thought going into this that would be the best way to go, and I was wrong on that, because really it comes down to the changes happening in 1 year. And so when you spread it out, it makes the line very wonky. And the smoothest line is a line where whatever you've got saved, you throw it at that year, because the change will only happen in 1 year. And so to spread it out made for wonky a wonky line. So we did run a number of scenarios, and surprised as well, landed on that being the best use of the fund. And so what it would do is it would be baked into the 5-year plan should council wish. But when we'd start discussions for the 2026 financial plan, this reserve use would be removed after you would find out the 2026 roll. There's a bylaw protecting these funds, and they can only be used if there's a decrease in the assessed value of the mill site. So, you know, it would just be an assumption that's built into your 2020 budget that you would revisit next year at this time. And I do think that that's what we did last year, was estimate that this year we would be offsetting our taxes. And as we can see, we're not going to be doing that. So we'll ensure that that's not part of the budget, unless there is an appeal or something that we find out about. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Councillor Doubt.
I want to speak too many times and repeat myself too many times, but I'm going to fall back on what the recommendation is in our package, which is really simple, not complicated. It says that the committee recommends staff increase the 2025 property tax levy by $600,000 to provide $600,000 for the taxation stabilization fund, take 2.2 million out in 2026, and change the 2025 to 2029 financial plan to do that. That's really straightforward. It's not complicated, not the same as what we did last year, but it is an effort, a serious effort, and a good recommendation to smooth tax increases over the year. I'm not sure that's going to make anybody really happy, but it smooths the taxation, and I understand that it means the tax increases don't come in big lumps all the time and give us a wonky line. So I think at tax time, people don't think about the wonky line. They think about the dollar value of the taxes they're going to have to pay. But I'm back to the issue. I think if we have to wait until the end of February to discuss where we are on revenue and expenses, that we're leaving that awfully late. I would rather be talking about it sooner than that. And for this, I would like to be dealing with a motion that makes this something that we deal with at the same time as we talk about the expenses, rather than trying to talk about them separately.
Okay, so I'm just using the round 2 list, and I had Councillor Southcott next if he had any questions this round. No. Councillor Palm, questions?
Yes, thank you, through the chair. Just one question. I think I need to hear it, or public may need to hear that. If we were to pass the motion recommendation in front of us to increase the tax stabilization reserve by $600,000 this year, yes or no, would we be increasing the burden of the taxpayers by $600,000 this year?
Through the chair, that is correct.
So that leads me to the point when staff brings forward the recommendations to get taxation down from the 11.5 or whatever number was first presented to the 5% that we were asking staff to bring forward. Staff is going to have to bring more recommendations as far as savings to the table. Is that my understanding?
Through the chair, that is correct.
Thank you very much.
Okay, that brings me back to me. Unless, did you want to ask a question? Okay, go ahead, Councillor Southcott.
It's contingent on Councillor Palm's question. My understanding is that there is crunch coming. Like we all know there's crunch coming, but we're speaking about one in particular, specifically that we're going to identify here. And that's inevitable. Our assumption is that is inevitable in the report, right? I think you already answered that question last time I asked it in a different way.
Through the chair, as far as is the property class change to that site inevitable, I might pull on Mr. Manger or Mr. Primo to comment on, likelihood around that. They don't have a crystal ball. They have had experience with other mill closures, and sometimes hearing different examples adds some context. I know I've spoken to some CFOs around the province who've had their mills shut down in their communities and such. And so I might call on either of our support crew today to add more information because they are the experts in this area.
Sure. Good afternoon, honorable council members, staff, and community members. My name is Mandeep Mahanger. I'm the manager of the specialized cost team. Our specialized cost team is responsible for the valuation and classification of the Powell River Sawmill, sorry. And we've been working closely on this portfolio due to the increased scrutiny it's coming under and the changes that are coming up. As you know, property assessments can change. So I'll start off with outlining the appeal period. Property assessments are open to appeal up until January 31st, 2025. So up until then, we will not know if the mill is challenging the property assessment. We have worked closely with Domtar now and Brooksfield. We have done annual inspections on the site to ensure all of the inventory and updates are correct. As you know, this year there was some further dismantling and closure requests on the pulp mill site that were processed, and they are continuing to work on it. We did ask if they had any demolition plans in place, any auction plans in place that would give us a further indication as to the timeline, but no. They're still considering their options to continue. So what I can share with you is that Paper Excellence and Domtar did have another site reclassed in British Columbia this year. That was a lot further along the dismantling process than the mill in Powell River. So there's always an amount of risk involved. However, with the close meetings and consultations we've done with the company, we feel a level of comfort with the assessment, but that's to say anything can change.
I have a question, speaker. Assessment.
Okay, so I think the information has generated some more questions. Councillor Isaacson has a question.
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair to point of privilege, speakers in the back of the room, the audience, we can hear you quite loudly or it's distracting. Thank you. Through the chair to BC Assessment, given the recent announcement of the possible purchase of some of the mill site by Tla'amin Nation, and so some of they're looking at the least environmentally impacted parcels, from my understanding in their press release. I'm wondering if there is a sense of, or how that might impact assessment of portions of the mill site for next year, or whether that distinction makes things unique compared to other communities. Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And the only information that we have on the sale of the site is what's been published in the media and the First Nations website. That would obviously impact the classification of those lands. For example, if they purchase the 140 some acres and use it for a different use that's not related to the pulp mill at all, which it obviously would, the classification would change. And with the classification change, as you know, from class 4 to class 6, there are different mill rates in place, which would impact your tax revenue.
Thank you. So there will be a change, but no predictions, no, yeah.
So what we have to look at is what the actual use of those lands are once they've sold. So if they were to undertake another industrial operation, it could go into class 5, light industry. It could go into a park or a recreation. It could go into class 8. So until they've made some further decisions on the site and the sale goes through, and then also it also depends on any zoning or development changes they would need to have in place before that use is a permitted use. These are all factors that we would have to take into consideration.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions about that? Okay. Oh, Councillor Southcott.
Yeah, it's through the chair to either Mandeep or Mo. I understand that if assessment appeals are registered, that information is available on a publicly accessible website. Is that true?
That is correct. So the first level appeal is with BC Assessment, and that's to the Property Assessment Review Panel. So those will not be on our public website because that's the first level of appeal. So once that appeal is filed, the first level begins, and that is quite a lay process. The Property Assessment Review Panel was set up more for single-family assessment, smaller businesses. And the reason I say that, we have allocated 30 minutes for that appeal, and it gives the appellant 15 minutes and the assessor 15 minutes, and then some time for adjudication. These complex property types do not get adjudicated at the Property Assessment Review Panel level. The issues are very complex. They need to be analyzed. Lawyers get involved. So typically, in my experience, a site like the mill would have to appeal to the first level, to the Property Assessment Review Panel. The value would just be confirmed. And in order for them to appeal to the second level, and that's what you're referencing here, that's the Property Assessment Appeal Board. And yes, all the appeals are listed on the Property Assessment Appeal Board website.
Thank you.
So that the first deadline for filing an appeal is January 31st. Level 1 appeal happens sometime after that, and then sometime after that, it goes on a public website for second level. Do we know what those timelines are?
Yeah, so I'll just give you a brief overview of the timelines. The inquiry period is open up until January 31st deadline to file an appeal. So you must have filed an appeal at the first level to go on to the second level. If you do not have an appeal at the Property Assessment Review Panel, the Property Assessment Appeal Board cannot consider a decision that they made. So what happens is our inquiry in part runs from January till March 15th. Property Assessment Review Panels close March 15th, and then we require some processing time to send out decision notices and that, and confirm the revised roll. And that's when the revised roll is issued with all the changes that occurred at the Property Assessment Review Panel level. Once that's done, there is a deadline to appeal to the Property Assessment Appeal Board. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's April 31st. I think Mo can confirm that for us. So by April 31st, they would have to have a second appeal in to the Property Assessment Appeal Board with all their papers and fees filed. And at that point, they will process those appeals. It takes them from 2 to 4 weeks maybe to get up on the website and update it.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? It looks like we have answered all the questions. Oh,
Through the chair, if I might ask a question of our BC assessment colleagues here. In your experience, and I know this might be a tough one, even when there is a mill closure, there's several years where it takes potentially for the reclassification because of the different permits, planning, and so forth, for that to impact a reassessment. So you'll see a reclassification typically, and then as a new owner may develop and figure out their different components of what they're doing, realizing perhaps a change in property class may take anywhere from 2 to 10 years, depending the complexity of the site. And why I'm asking this question to UBC Assessment is one of the things our community and our council are struggling with is how we buffer from those impacts, and whether we go with a 5% property tax increase this year or 11.4 or whatever council chooses. The fact is that we are perhaps prudent to try and anticipate 2026 to maybe even 2030 of having an impact of having a redistribution of our taxes from one class to another. So I'm wondering if you could help with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the crystal ball scenario that Mallory had talked about earlier. I personally have seen different major industrial sites being demolished and redeveloped over different timeline. All it comes down to is the motivation from the owner, the future use, and their plans in place. Classification would change. It does not require a complete demolition of the site. So let me give you an example of that and explain it further. In this example, there's a cement plant located in the province of British Columbia, which closed down. So as we all know, demolition permits, environmental permits, and all that takes some time to get into place. So what this cement plant did is they applied to the assessor for closure and reclassification on the basis that this cement plant is no longer capable of operating as cement plant because we have now gone in and removed a kiln. A kiln is $20 to $30 million. This kiln can no longer function as it is. However, in order for them to demolish that kiln completely, it may cost them $50 million. So what they do is go in and is remove key components and remove components of that make it inoperable to function as that. In addition, they also undertook a service line rerouting. So all of their piping and facilities from that cement facility were no longer capable of filling up those silos. They changed the use as a transload. They trucked in product from other sites and reused their silos. So they weren't shut down, they weren't in demolition, but what they did was they took key components out, the kiln being one, the firing procedure, the process piping, which in fact now left a site which is no longer capable of producing cement as it was designed and built for. That itself triggered a classification change on the property. So there's no hard and fast rule. It all depends on the motivation of the owners, the purchasers, the vendors, and the allowable use that they're intending to put it to, and the budget. And as we know, demolition is quite expensive and it takes time.
I have a question. The parcel is like one large parcel with various uses on it at this point. If there's sales of pieces of it and it's subdivided and it becomes more than one parcel, there might be changes to classifications to parts of it, but because there are more than one parcels, your overall value may not necessarily reflect a downgrade. Is that the case?
You're right. It all depends on the use of the individual parcels. So say if they sold 10 parcels out of 100 and those parcels got put to a different use, well, we would review the parcel, the existing use on it, the market value, any exemptions that are applicable, and it would be assessed as such. So
lots of unanswered questions and scenarios.
There are a number of parcels in this site. From my understanding, it's not one large parcel. Under the Assessment Act, we have the ability to group parcels and assess them together when they have industrial improvements that are sitting on the site.
Can you refresh our memory on this site? We have the hydro dam, or the dam that produces electricity, and it's being used and owned by someone separately, but not registered as a sort of a separate piece. Can you help us once again by explaining the nature of that and how that impacts us?
Sure. So this property is a very complex property as it was built over the years. And as I mentioned last year, this appeal was appealed and went to the Property Assessment Review Panel level, to the Property Assessment Appeal Board level. It went to stated case to the Supreme Court and went to the Appeals Court. So I went all the way to the top. And the issues were the classification of the dam and the mill. Initially, BC Assessment had classified the mill as Class 4 and the dam as 2, as utilities. However, as a part of the adjudication and the several appeals, it was determined that the mill was designed and built to service, that the dams were built and designed to service the mill site. Therefore, the dams are Class 4. because that was the intended purpose to use in a major industrial application. So currently, yes, the Brookfield assets are currently running and they're currently assessed under Class 4. At this time, they are still running all their power infrastructure through the mill site. The mill site still uses power for their maintenance and operations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions from our committee members? It looks like we have exhausted our questions. Oh, do you have a question?
No, I was going to start with a motion to get the discussion rolling.
All right, we're going to start with motions. Go ahead, Councillor Isaacson.
Thank you. I'm going to propose something. I'm hoping the wording makes sense with that option that you described. I'm going to recommend that the committee recommends staff include an option to increase the 2025 property tax levy by $600,000 to include a $600,000 transfer to the 2025 property tax stabilization reserve fund, period. I would like to debate the other as a separate motion.
And we have that seconded by Councillor Doubt. I'm wondering if it might be practical to have the motion put up where we can see it.
Through the chair to staff, the only thing, a change that I made to the recommendation in the package is after staff, include an option 2. And okay, thank you. And so if I could speak to the motion, first of all, I just want to check in through the chair to staff. Does this meet the needs that you were discussing in terms of an option?
Through the chair, I think this is excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So my rationale for focusing on $600,000 is to start when we have the deliberations and see the full suite. We can full suite of options in February 27th. That we're looking from that point at a high and looking at opportunities to save. I'm generally, when it comes to putting aside money for the future to offset fluctuations, I tend to go in that direction. And so this is an opportunity to do that. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is where I will land when we discuss the full budget, but this gives us a starting point and we could reduce it if we are trying to find a way to reduce tax increases in 2025, knowing that that decision does make an impact to 2026 in the future as well. So that's my rationale for starting here.
Councillor Doubt.
So is the motion that shows up on our screen the motion you intended to make, Councillor Isaacson? Because it's a little different than what I heard you saying.
Well, that the committee recommends that staff include an option 2. Yep, that all. Is it levy?
I think it's missing in draft 2.
I didn't say draft.
Go ahead and tell you what I was thinking, why I saw it as different.
Okay.
I thought you were proposing that we basically make this recommendation part of the options that council asked staff to bring us for the tax increases on the spending side. And it looks like this: motion to increase taxes by $600,000, and that's the only option.
Thank you. I also believed we were speaking about when draft comes out and making that option in draft 2 as an option within the draft 2, and it doesn't really specify that. And I think that would address what Councillor Doubt's talking about. Was that your intention?
That was my intention. Yeah.
Through the chair, if you might give Caitlin a chance here. Caitlin, you're going to look at the original recommendation, and Councillor Isaacson has only changed the first part, but we need the full wording, and then I think that will help council see it in its entirety. So I'm just going to cut and paste it for you in the report.
Are we waiting for?
Yeah, I think it would be best just to be clear on the motion before we start debating it.
And just if I could say through to the chair and staff, it sometimes takes us a little while to catch up with you as we do this.
Yeah, we can wait. It's not a problem.
Yes. Am I okay to speak, Chair?
Well, right now
Still looks like it's changing.
we're just waiting for a sec. They'll let us know when they're ready.
Through the chair, can you make sure that I have the correct recommendation on the screen?
So you've added from my original wording, but it is what my intention was, because the original recommendation kind of had two parts, but they both related to draft 2 of the budget deliberations. It captures my intention more fully. So given that we've already had a motion moved and seconded, I think this would probably be an amendment. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask Councillor Dowd, does that reflect what you thought the motion was?
This reflects really closely what I thought I was seconding. So I'm in favor of the motion. I'm in favor of accepting this version as a motion that's already been moved and seconded.
Okay. Thank you.
So are we okay, staff, to move with this motion, or should we have a motion to amend it to?
Through the chair, what you have here is what I understood that you moved, as Councillor Dowd pointed out. So I think you're good to proceed. Thank you. Without an amendment.
Okay, so the motion that we see now is now on the floor properly, and we can open it for debate. Do we have anyone here who wishes to comment on the motion before us? Councillor Dowd.
I want to say thank you to staff for putting this all together and putting together a very inclusive report. As Councillor Palm said, there's a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs in this, but when you read them carefully, it's a very understandable report. It's not happy news that we're going to have to ask people for $600,000 more in taxes, but I think it's clear, and the idea to put this together so that we're dealing with both sides of the balance sheet equation at the same time is a good idea, so I support it.
Thank you. Councillor Southcott?
Thanks, Chair. So I also appreciate you doing this report. Like I said before, I always try to boil things down, but you do a better job than I do of it. I appreciate that. And I support this as well. My own personal values are that if I see pain coming and it's inevitable, then I'm not one to put it off hoping that it's not going to happen, because I'd rather bite into it and work on managing that from the standpoint of the reality of it, rather than dream about or hope that it's not going to happen. It gives me a greater sense of control, even though it may be uncomfortable and challenging to figure out how to do that. And I think that's the option that you've given us here in this option. And so I support this recommendation. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Palm?
Yes, thank you, through the chair. Yes, I support this motion as well, because as an option, it doesn't tie us to anything at this point. It simply allows us to have further discussion before we pick one of these options. But I have a question that came to mind when our assessors were on the screen, referring to the dam as going to class 4. Isn't the dam presently class 2?
Through the chair, the dam is class 4.
Has been this past year.
Through the chair, that is correct.
Thanks for that clarification.
So I'll speak in favor of the motion too. I don't need to repeat any of what my colleagues are doing. I do like the idea of putting this forward at the same time as we have a better picture of how our assessment role comes out and might land for your average family dwelling with respect to draft 2 before we make any decisions on that, because the increase or decrease to the total tax roll is not the same as how it impacts single family dwellings, because this assessment indicates, there's some non-market changes in the residential sector as well, which will also impact where we land. And so having all of those pieces together so we can clearly see them, I think would be the time to make decisions like that. So I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That's unanimous. Thank you.
Okay, through the chair, before you move on, if I might just say a few words to help the community and perhaps yourselves. The report that you got was quite graphic, and one of the reasons that Ms. Denniston has been using a range of communication tools is for some people, pictures paint the picture, others, words. I must admit that for me, seeing this with a graph and a range of alternative ways of communicating, it's a tool. And for some members of our public, they're visual. And for others, they want the details. This provides both. And Ms. Denniston has been innovating since I've met her in different ways of engaging the community. So I thank you for acknowledging her work on this, because this is a very unique community and a very unique circumstance that our staff are dealing with. So thank you, Councillor Dowd and Southcott and the rest of you for recognizing that. Thank you.
Well, I concur. I thought the report had very beautiful graphs and tables, and I really very much enjoyed them. So thank you for that. So the next item.
There's a second part of that recommendation that I wanted to address as well, or at least ask a question to staff for, about the $2.2 million contribution. Okay, go ahead. So the motion that I made previously didn't address the $2.2 million contribution. I'm wondering, most of the report spoke to the $600,000. We don't actually have data or options related to the $2.2 million use. And so I'm wondering, do you need this information for draft 2 of the budget? Could this motion be referred to a later time?
Through the chair, it could absolutely be referred to another time. It is not critical that in 2026, your starting point budget is assumed to use the stabilization reserve. I think it's fair to assume to not use it and to layer it in next January if there is a big change. So there's not a right or a wrong way to do it. In this scenario, it was put in there because it aligned with the assumptions in the 5-year strategy, but it's definitely not wrong to build in savings in 2025 and decide not to predict when to use that reserve, because you will have another shot at deciding when to use it when you have that information in front of you. So thank you for the question, and I think that's a good clear direction to go as well.
Given that, I move that the committee refers withdrawals from the property tax stabilization reserve fund to future, or to 2026 to 2030 financial budget deliberations.
Just a sec. So it is my understanding that no motion at all would do that exactly anyways. It would bump it forward as part of future deliberations. So my question is whether a motion is desired or needed at this point.
Through the chair, I think it would be preferable not to have a motion just in case the assessment is appealed, and then we do have to discuss it in 2025. So we wouldn't need to make a motion. We would simply respond to any sort of change in the assessment and respond accordingly. But thank you very much.
Okay. Happy to.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to consider that agenda item done, if everybody's happy with that. And we can move on to 6.1, which is community engagement reports. We could start with Councillor Palm if you like.
This season, and time spent with family is always enjoyable. So in terms of in community engagement, Council, I think we all received the same email from the president of the Westview Ratepayers recently. And because of budget discussions that are going on, a lot of detail, as we have found out today, the president of the Ratepayers has asked us if he could get an extension on the survey that we have out there presently that's supposed to include, I think, this Thursday and the 19th, or sometime soon. He's asking for an extension until the end of January. There's no specific date, but I'm just wondering how council feels about that request, because one of the councillors responded saying that this may not be possible. And as we have heard today, there's a lot to consider in terms of the budget this time around. So I'm just wondering if council would entertain an extension
I got
to
it.
that survey.
So right now we're reporting out on our community engagement, and I understand that that's a question that you have. What I suggest is you put that letter on an agenda where we are able to discuss it as a committee. Nobody would have come prepared to talk about that because it's not on the agenda. So I would also like to talk about it, but I'm thinking, staff, what would be the next available agenda where we could put that on?
Through the chair, it would be either the Committee of the Whole on the 21st or the 23rd would probably the council meeting of the 23rd of this month. I would like to observe that the schedule that was laid out with the engagement is part of the timeline approved in terms of getting the budget deliberations and getting feedback to you. There are always other points where people can give feedback, but delaying that survey will impact the feedback that we come back to with and options around the budget. So, Mr. Neston, I don't wish, would you like to speak a bit further to that? Thank you.
Point of order. I think, Chair, you've asked, you haven't asked for discussion on this topic. You asked for when the next meeting that it could go on. And so I think that question's been answered.
Yeah, and given that the deadline upcoming is prior to the next available agenda, I wonder if there are alternative mechanisms for us to consider this question, maybe not here today, but before the deadline.
Through the chair, you would be calling a special meeting if you wanted to deliberate that and bring it forward to council.
So, Councillor Palm, I would suggest you approach the mayor about asking if he would call a special meeting for considering that, just because we don't have it properly on the agenda today. And so
you're asking me to do what?
I think you need to approach the mayor to ask him to ask for a special meeting to before the deadline to have that conversation with the committee or the council. That would, I think, be proper procedure.
So my question to that, in that regard, is the mayor going to be available before the 19th for a special meeting?
You'd have to ask him. He's not here.
We do have an acting mayor.
Through the chair, if you wouldn't mind giving me a second to have a conversation with our deputy corporate officer to see if there's a way for this to be brought forward in a procedurally correct way today, that would probably be.
We're going to move along to the next person's community report, and if you would like to get back to us a little bit later, just let me know. Okay, Councillor Dow.
Yeah, so many things we could talk about now.
Your report, please.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about community engagement, and there hasn't been a lot of official meetings or anything between our last meeting, which was the 19th, just before Christmas. But I enjoyed being out in the community and talking to different people in a happy and positive kind of a framework for the Christmas period. And I just enjoyed all of the positive interactions with members of the community over the time. It was long enough for me, at least, to feel relaxed and rested before we came back and got back into the same old again. And next time we have a community engagement, I think I'll have a longer list of things to talk about.
Thank you. Councillor Southcott?
Just one thing I'd like to mention. I attended the Townsite Ratepayers Society general meeting last night, which was interesting. It was pretty well attended. Members from the Westview Ratepayers, including the president, Rick Craig, and a couple of others attended. The president basically brought the Townsite Ratepayers Society up to date on what they're up to, what their plans are. I think some of us were at their meeting in December, the Westbury Ratepayers meeting in December. We reported on that basically. There was a fair bit of discussion that had to do with finance, and particularly what we've discussed today. And I just, there was some discussion as well, more or less in which I was involved in, that related to engagement and communication back and forth. It's somewhat remarkable to me that there's still a fairly widespread impression in the community that people are not finding out about things in a timely way, even though I know over the years we've tried harder and harder to do that. So I'm sure we'll continue to discuss that, because I know our intention hasn't decreased over the years. The second thing is the just the value of helping people understand more complete information, because it's my observation, and I'll just use one specific example, that information which isn't necessarily complete, it can be accurate, but not complete in terms of context and everything that's involved, can convey a very different and sometimes highly worrying impression than which we don't need anything. We don't need extra causes for anxiety and apprehension these days. None of us do. The specific example was something that's come up a number of times before, and that is looking at mill rates basically and comparing them between different communities as an indicator of our tax rates, but without also including a consideration of assessment values. The mill rates really convey a very not a useful and pretty much in ways wrong impression. So there was some discussion of that last night as well. I really feel the reason I bring this up is because I feel it's important for us to have as complete information as possible through our community. And I'm so grateful that there's so many people interested in what we're doing around this table and the business of our community that is the responsibility of our council. And now we have ratepayers and many people in our community, organizations and individuals who want to take a part, which I just see as a huge indication of democracy. We really need to optimize this. So I will continue attending ratepayers meetings, and I was really glad to be invited to the Townsite Ratepayers Society last night, because I haven't really attended their meetings before. And they had 14 members, I believe, and various guests. So out of the 60 or more members of that organization. So it was a really good meeting, and I really enjoyed it. That's me. Thank you.
Yeah, I do believe we have some exodus due to Pierre Puglio's event coming up soon tonight. And so we'll move on to Councillor Isaacson's report.
Thank you, Chair. So before the holidays, I attended a Philosopher's Cafe. It was a monthly gathering with a number of local residents, and the topic was hope. And it was a really lovely conversation, especially for the time of year. And it's always an interesting, well, I was going to say it's a philosophical conversation. It literally is. It's a Philosopher's Cafe. So it's great to have a bit of an academic chinwag at the United Church, hosted by that just happens to be the location. Cinema Politica hosted a screening of Goodwin's Way, and I saw Councillor Doubt there speaking on the panel. Really fantastic documentary on the history of coal mining in Cumberland, and the one figure in particular who to some people is a labor hero, and for others is a a draft dodger. So really fantastic documentary and discussion afterwards. I attended, and Councillor Southcott was there as well, the local government offsite construction accelerator information session. And this is with local governments who are interested in exploring off-site manufacturing of homes in order to accelerate the building. So it's we do not have the capacity in terms of skilled laborers in our province to manufacture housing one at a time. But if they were built off-site in a modular or through panel way, we could accelerate the building of housing. And so this was a bit of an information session on the opportunities there, but then I had to leave a little bit early before the end. But one of the main topics of conversation, what I really stressed was, this is a fantastic idea, and I said Powell River would be a place where, our council is quite interested in, or has expressed interest in, pursuing housing in different ways, and we would possibly be interested in hosting these types of housing on city-owned properties, or figuring out, attracting the sort of industry to town. But the capacity to just carry that out when, in particular, planning and partnership staff are dealing with housing legislation changes and official community plan requirements, and just the development permit application processes, and just getting the ongoing work of the city done. It's really hard to champion that sort of stuff forward in smaller communities without the staff base. So I just raised that as an issue. Attended the overdose prevention site subcommittee of the community action team, and just further discussions on the possibility of securing the next site once the current site closes March 31st, and that's an ongoing conversation. And then yesterday, it was the ad hoc, not yet formalized housing roundtable that met, and we're making progress on terms of reference, and so hopefully once that is finalized and a group actually creates itself, then we can decide as a council whether or not it's worthwhile having an official liaison, or whether it's a community initiative where we can have voluntary involvement at our leisure. So those are mine.
Thank you, Councillor Isaacson. So that leaves me with me. I attended the Chamber of Commerce board meeting yesterday on behalf of the mayor and myself, and they discussed updates to the new announcement around the common lands and what else might be happening there. We talked a little bit about the process for their upcoming gala, where they're doing nominations for the various awards that they give out, and they start out with sort of a nomination process that also requires a committee that vets and makes decisions about that. So they are looking for people to volunteer to be on the what do they call that? The awards judging committee. Yeah, so they are looking to formulate an awards judging committee. So people who are interested in being part of that could contact the chamber and put their name forward if they thought that was something for them. They're looking for some variety in the types of folks that they have on the committee, so they get lots of input. So that was the one thing I wanted to report out that I did just yesterday. And I would love to go to some more of the ratepayers committee meetings. Mondays I tend to curl though, so I couldn't make that, but curling was also wonderful. Which brings us to the end of engagement reports and on to 8.1, which is Minister Invitation to Housing Speed Networking Event. Councillor Isaacson.
Thank you, Chair. Make the motion and then see if there's discussion on it. I move that the committee directs staff to arrange an invitation from council to Minister Ravi Kahlon to the Housing Speed Networking event on January 31st.
Seconded by Councillor Southcott.
So the rationale for this is staff have been working with staff of other agencies to bring in folks from BC Housing and BC Builds, etc., to be able to meet with local housing organizations and other interested members of the community, for example, landowners. But it was brought to my attention that in order for someone at a political level to come, that invitation should come from the political body. And so that's why I'd offered it to add it as a last or a late addition to this agenda here today. I know I believe our MLA has RSVP'd to, I believe our MLA has RSVP to attend. I'm not actually sure. Again, that's another political person, so I'm still not completely clear on how invitations go out. But the suggestion was made that Minister Kahlon, if the opportunity arose and it fit into his schedule, and could potentially connect to other things going on in the community, that he could attend. But that's up in the air. I'm not suggesting that that's a sure thing whatsoever, but at least the invitation should go out in case he was able to come and join members of our community who attend.
So I'm going to get to Councillor Doubt, who's next on the speaking list, but does staff know anything about whether our MLA is coming or not coming?
Through the chair today, we actually did get confirmation of that. And if I may, through the chair, explain how the invitations went out. This event was building on a staff webinar where we were bringing together a diverse group of community nonprofits, people who are involved in development, people who own land, faith groups, etc., to hear information about funding through federal and provincial entities. And we had Elizabeth Tang, Lisa Helps from BC Builds, and Naomi Brunemeyer. And it was basically information that would have perhaps come to us that we felt had benefit to our wider colleagues out there. And as a follow-up to that meeting, which was quite successful and online, the ask was, there was clearly a desire for people to meet in person. And there was a willingness from our colleagues in Victoria and Vancouver to actually visit our community. So that was the start of it. It wasn't intended to be political quasi, but there was no restriction that we were putting on who was interested in attending. We've invited different community groups, whether they're ratepayers groups, and it's just a way of bringing people together in a nonpartisan, productive way that may hopefully lead and leverage partnerships that either involve us or don't involve us. And when the right time comes for decisions to come to council, we will let you know if there's things that require your resourcing and support. So the addition of Minister Kahlon, staff obviously didn't go that route, but it was a good point. And the more we can leverage attention for our community and funding, the better. And if council supports that, we will proceed. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Doubt.
It's not the first time I've seen invitations to this. Actually, the first invitations I saw were an invitation to directors of the regional district several months ago, back, well before November 8th, probably in October sometime, about that. And I haven't seen this on a council agenda ever. And I know there's been a housing group working together. I don't know who's paying for it or who's controlling it or who's driving it. I know there's a group. I think there's maybe one or two councillors on that group and staff people. And my curiosity, because we haven't seen it here before, is who is driving that bus and who is paying for it. And I'd like to know those answers. And we can have a nice social January 31st. I think I'd like to know some of the details about how it's going forward, because I really think council should know if it's a council agenda.
CAO, please.
Through the chair, this is what as staff, we considered part of operational. We work with our colleagues regularly, whether it's with Lahaman or Lyft or different entities. So this is something that's being done out of our operational budgets that doesn't require an increase to budgets that we would typically come to council for. It's fairly nominal. We're doing it at Dwight Hall with light refreshments over lunch, not unlike how we organize the situation table meeting for information for community. And then knowing that we have CEOs and other senior staff and also council who are interested in meeting with community, you were included in that. So staff did provide an explanation of this as a follow-up from the webinar that was online. And again, the choice was to try and have something in person versus the webinar that we had done last year. So the budget's there. It's I saw that it was within our operational purview as staff. And if there's something you would like to have seen done differently, I'm very open to hearing that. Thank you.
Councillor Palm.
Yeah, this is kind of short notice for a minister to attend anything. I don't agree with the timelines here, but could certainly gather information and take something to UBCM with a meeting with him individually or whatever works down the road. But timelines in terms of this ask is, I don't think it's workable.
So just a question to staff. Would we be breaking any kind of protocol or making a faux pas by extending an invitation to our minister at this late hour, or it was preceded by an election and a cabinet shuffle and trying to get over? I'm just curious about what you're thinking about that.
Through the chair, there are times where sometimes you may invite a minister knowing full well they are booked up weeks in advance as a courtesy to raise their attention that their staff are participating. And so it may be that he's aware through his various staff, or he may not. And so it's, again, to my mind, it's a piece of paper. It doesn't hurt. It's very little effort of staff to put that forward for the mayor's signature. But it's your,
sometimes they send their
purview.
deputy or something. Right?
It's your purview. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Isakson.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to Councillor Doubt. There's a bit of an insinuation that this could be being driven by the Housing Roundtable, and I just want to clarify that I brought this to the Housing Roundtable as I knew that this is something that the city was doing, but it was not driven by the Housing Roundtable. The Housing Roundtable at this point is a collection of people who are interested in advancing housing or to support housing in the community who are involved in getting people housed. And when I report back on that right now with community engagement reports, I report back on that just as I attend, for example, Cinema Politica events. I'm not there as a city councillor, but I happen to be a city councillor, and it's a way that I connect with members of the community on things that I meet with people who might care about the same things that I do. So just want to clarify that this is nothing related to the Housing Roundtable, but I did mention it there because it's something I report on, things that I'm aware of that the city is doing as it relates to housing. And that's where the question came up. And that's why I brought this forward. Thank you.
Councillor Doubt.
I wasn't trying to insinuate anything. I asked a question about where the initiative came from and what's driving it. I got an answer from the CEO that she is driving it and she is using her discretion with operating funds of the city.
Yep.
That was the answer.
Thank you.
I asked the question because I wanted to know the answer, and we haven't had a report in any way on that at City Council, and I think Council should know.
So I'm just going to clarify our CAO is a CAO anyway. Do we have any other questions on the motion, or can I call the question? All in favor? Any opposed? One opposed. Councillor Palm. Motion carries. So that brings us to 9.1, which is the notice of motion. And we don't discuss it here today, but maybe staff could tell us which meeting this notice of motion will come forward on.
Through the chair, this will go forward to the January 23rd meeting.
So January 23rd council, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Point of privilege, Chair.
Oh,
Okay, no, you go ahead. I think you were first.
We just received information from staff on how to discuss the correspondence that Councillor Palm addressed. If we wanted to add it to tonight's agenda.
okay, maybe just go ahead. CAO, maybe you can let me know.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor Isaacson. I was going to. So with the correspondence that we received yesterday from the Westview ratepayers, if council wishes to discuss it, you can add it to the agenda for discussion. Just make a motion to amend the agenda and add it as, you could add it as, I guess,
8.2.
Yeah.
We passed it, but we can go back.
Yeah.
Councillor Palm, did you wish to make a motion about that?
Just wondering if we could add it to the Thursday night agenda.
We have no agenda for Thursday night. The next one is, yeah,
That's correct. And through the chair, because of the timing with the request,
I see you. I just want to finish with this topic.
I'll make the motion if we can keep it short.
So you were making a motion to add it to the agenda for 8.2. Is anybody going to second that motion? Seconded by Councillor Southcott. So that puts that motion on the floor. Did you want to speak to that motion or?
You want to speak to it?
Okay, carry on.
Want to speak to the propriety of, at the end of a meeting, adding something to the agenda that hasn't been on the agenda when the agendas are pre-published. I think it's bad practice. I think our policy, our procedure bylaw says that if you're going to add things to the agenda, you do add things to the agenda at the beginning of the meeting and give notice to everybody that you're doing it. There's been plenty of time to do that. I saw the letter from the Westview ratepayers well over 24 hours. And if I had wanted to bring it up, I would have, but I didn't. I don't think it's an emergency. I want to spend the whole night talking about it. I'll have things to say if we get to it. But I think we keep expanding our procedure to do things that I think are a bad idea. I was actually reading a book this afternoon by Mr. Clough about procedure for boards and bylaws and procedure for city councils. And one of the suggestions he was making was don't deal with things on a rushed basis, adding things onto agenda late without reports and without consideration and going that way. I think it's a bad idea to think about things that way. We've got a motion, it's on, you've allowed it to be made, it's seconded, and I don't want to have a big argument about procedure, but I think we're going down a really rocky road, and I'm not sure what we're doing, talking about procedure bylaws, if we're never going to pay attention to them.
Just a sec. So it was my understanding that the procedure bylaw did restrict changing the agenda to the beginning, which is why I had made that advice to Councillor Palm during that time. I have to trust that the staff's giving us good advice that we do have the flexibility to do that at this point in time. The motion is currently on the floor, so I'm going to allow us to proceed. I take it you would be against the motion. Councillor Palm? Because we don't have an agenda, Councillor Palm, it's an open house run by the city staff for public to come and talk about the budget. We as a group don't have an agenda or a meeting.
We don't have another committee this month, correct?
through the chair, you have one on January 21st and then also on the 23rd. So
Clarify. Simple for everybody for a discussion. Can we not just, this is an item, extend the timeline from the 19th to the 21st to see if we want to extend the survey timeline?
Through the chair, the budget schedule before council was approved by council in May, and one of the thoughts behind it was
Point of order. Through the chair, are we discussing whether to add it to the agenda or the motion? Like, I think that's the discussion.
I think it was a procedural question. He wanted to know whether it was possible to do it a different way. And so I'm going to allow staff to answer the question.
Thank you.
Through the chair, the implication would be for council to change the budget schedule. So instead of draft 2 on February 27th, it would be bumped to a date in March. We're currently presented draft 1, and then at certain points as information becomes available, we receive direction from the committee to consider that as part of draft 2. Part of that information that we now have is the assessment, and now we have some direction for draft 2. The other part is all the engagement that's being done, and what we have is 3 days next week to compile all of the online and in-person engagement, 3 days to prepare the report and analyze it all so it can go through proper review cycle and make the February 4th meeting so we could take further direction to embed that direction into February 27th. So in order for draft 2 to come forward with comprehensive options that reflect all the new information we received between December and February, those dates are as tight as they can be. So if we extend the survey, I mean, there are other options. We could extend it. Just that feedback wouldn't be part of the engagement report, but perhaps we could email it out. All of the responses we receive after, we could attach it to the February 27th draft 2, say, here's some additional comments. I mean, we could just keep it open the whole time and have a pop-up that says, hey, you know, the cutoff to have this considered as part of the engagement report for February 4th is January 19th, but you're welcome to provide us with feedback, and we could then include it in all the future reports. So two options there as well to for the committee to consider.
Thank you. So I'm just going to remind us where we're at right now. We have a motion on the floor to add it to the agenda. We're not actually talking about the topic itself. So if we could refrain from more questions about that topic and just deal with whether we want to put it on the agenda or not at this point in time. Do we have any other, Councillor Isaacson?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, I think I'm in line with Councillor Dout's thinking. We have a procedure bylaw. It may be changing, but it's really important that if we want to bring something onto the agenda that isn't new information, that isn't last minute, that we follow those procedures and we provide notice to council in advance.
Councillor Southcott?
We're putting this on the agenda because the reason I seconded it was to get the answer that the CFO just provided. And that was what I suspected when the question came up last night as well. I do believe that we did advertise this Christmas. I'm not going to go any farther than that. So I've got what I wanted.
So we would go into round 2 now. Are you still having a comment? Councillor Dout?
I just want to comment on whether to add it to the agenda or not. And I don't think we should add it to the agenda for the procedural reasons that I suggested, for the reasons that have been given by this Chief Financial Officer about the necessity to end the survey at some particular point so that we can have valid reports going forward. And for the fact that we had at the beginning of the presentation of the financial reports this morning or this evening, a long list of when we started. It was back into the spring of this year when we started publishing the timeframes for the budget considerations, and the survey has been on that from the very beginning, from this spring until now. And we've talked about it. People have attended, lots of people from the Westview ratepayers have attended and sat in the seats at the meeting while we've talked about that schedule. I don't know how many times we've talked in this room about the schedule with all kinds of people present, including Councillor Palm, and we've talked it over and over again. And, I think all we can do is the best we can to inform people about what we're doing, give them a chance to participate. But I don't think we should put this on the agenda.
So do we have any other burning desires to speak, or should I call the question? All in favor of putting it on the agenda? All opposed? Everybody was opposed, so that motion fails. That brings us to the question period. Do we have anyone present who would like to ask a question?
Good afternoon, Chair and Council. It's Sherry Burton, and I hope you've all had a good start to 2025. I have a couple of questions with regards to agenda item 5.1. I was hoping that the CFO could tell us what the a single-family dwelling amount is for 2025.
CFO.
Through the chair, Ms. Burton, I'll email that to you after.
Okay.
And I can calculate it in just a moment here. I'll pull up my file, but I can also email that so that you don't have to write that number down. But I'll have to pull up my Excel spreadsheet to grab that for you.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to understand the mill taxation revenue and how that will work going forward if it gets reclassified. So in 2024, the revenue was $5,179,000 and change. So I'm guessing if there's no reclassification by an appeal, it should be about 5 million, just under 5 million this year.
Through the chair, was careful in the report because the property tax rates aren't set, and I've used estimates based on prior year assumptions. I was pretty careful not to publish preliminary tax rates, though I did require them for the calculations. So I'm pretty careful not to talk about future tax rates that council hasn't discussed yet. But you would be correct in assuming that because of a non-market decrease of that amount, and you can apply the prior year tax rate, that would be a reasonable estimate. Though I will say the revised roll could change from the completed roll, and tax rates haven't been discussed. So I wanted to answer your question, but have that proviso.
Okay, so if the it gets reclassified in 2026, the report proposes using that fund, the 2.2 million. So if it's reclassified, is there an anticipation that's going to be reclassified for 2026? So with the mill taxation revenue is forecasted, I know it's not written in stone, about 3 million or something? Like, is it around those kind of numbers?
Through the chair, in the analysis, I've had to use pretty confidential estimates because it's a site, private ownership and for sale. I was able to produce this analysis because it is high level and rolls up a lot of data, but unfortunately that piece of information is confidential at this point in time.
Okay, so then with the forecasting, if there's no more PTSR fund in 2027, how can there be a forecast that a single family dwelling taxation rate will only go up $400 a year for 2027, 2028, 2029?
Through the chair, the question was, how can you forecast average single family dwelling without property taxes being set?
Well, just I'm just, because when I look at the report, I get a bit perplexed. The charts show it's approximately $400 difference once we use up the PTSR fund. Every year, the single family dwelling property tax will increase about $400.
Through the chair, what that's saying is under that option between 2024 and 2025, the increase would be 400, and then next year would be about 427. And then all the other increases are based on the assumption of the property tax levy that was used in draft 1, which is still subject to change. And then it assumes the same property assessment with that one change to major industry. So those are the assumptions to come up with those estimates.
Okay, so in the 9 months ago on the 5-year financial plan for 2024 onward, there was the forecast that in 2025, property tax increase would be 8%. And now we're looking between 11.4 to 15.5 pursuant to this report. So I'm trying to understand how how 9 months ago, a forecast of 8%, when a lot of these things were already in play. There's a little bug here. So I'm trying to understand how this wasn't considered for the 2024 to the 5-year, the last 5-year financial plan. I'm trying to understand that because it sounds like this was obviously a consideration and a concern that could happen. So I'm trying to understand why this wasn't sort of, we weren't sort of notified, or it was on the radar 9 months ago.
Through the chair, this stabilization reserve was created last year through budget deliberations, and council very prudently set aside 1.6 million. And so it has been discussed a lot. There is a video online as well, kind of like a graphic video that really elaborates on the creation of the stabilization reserve and what it means for the future. So this has been part of our discussions of the last budget session, and we didn't know until January 1st this year if we would be drawing on that reserve, adding to it, or doing nothing. So each year we work with the information we have each January when the assessment comes out, but this has been, discussed a lot in the prior budget cycle when the establishment of the reserve happened.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Burton. Do we have any other questions from anybody present or online? Anybody on? No one online? Okay. And it looks like our press left too, because he went to the bigger fish over at the Pierre Poilievre event. If
Motion to adjourn?
Thank you. Second? Seconded by Councillor Southcott. All in favor? Any opposed? It passes unanimously. Thank you. We are adjourned.